Hey there, my name is Andrew Bristansky, and today we're going to be talking about the 28mm f2 Ultron version 2 from Voigtlander. Before we begin, I'd like to thank my friends over at Camtech for supplying the lens for this review, and I'd also like to thank you for watching, and thank you for the 1,000 subscribers. It means a lot, and it really helps me make these videos because it takes a lot of time and effort to produce each one of these videos, and I appreciate your support. So I've had a blast using this lens. I even shot an entire wedding with it almost as my main lens the entire time. It really holds up to the challenge, and I'm excited to share all the photos with you that I've taken so far with this lens. So let's start with the handling and the build quality of this lens. So Voigtlander really nailed this lens. It took everything that I loved about the 21 color scope R 3.5 that I have. It perfected it. Wow, just using this lens is a total treat. This is really everything that I love about Leica lenses in general. It's compact, it's sharp, it's just, there's very little compromises with regards to the image quality, and it just feels like you're using a quality tool every time you touch it. The aperture, for instance, is so defined and dampened and precise. I mean, check this out. Just beautiful. I love it. And it just feels like you're moving a slab of brass. Don't let the 35mm filter thread fool you. This thing is built like a tank. And the focus is nice and dampened and very precise. It's not as smooth as some of the better lenses I've used, but also for the price, I really shouldn't complain about anything because this thing just checks way too many boxes for the price. The focusing is nice and smooth. The build quality is top notch. There's no wiggle or play anywhere on the lens. If you gave me this in a blind test and hid the logo and told me this was a brand new released Leica Summicron, I would believe you. This thing is so well built, and the fact that it's just all brass, I mean, hey, you can't go wrong. It's black paint too. It's so shiny, and I can't wait to see how this thing will wear out over time because it will be beautiful to reveal that brass underneath it. And hey, look, take note, Leica, that tab is brass as well, and it's the perfect layout. It's it's obviously concave, but the layout is extremely similar to that of my 50 Summilux. It tapers upwards towards the edge of the barrel, leading up to the camera, so your finger really falls into it, and it makes focusing a total breeze. It's much better than the tab on my 40mm 1.4 that I have, the Nocton. This one feels just a notch above that, pun intended. So the build quality is superb. It's just a slab of brass, and it's so tight. I just can't get over it. The build quality is really up there. It's completely sealed in, and the lens is a pretty standard design. You can see the there's a base for the helicoid at the bottom here to help with the rangefinder patch, and the rear element doesn't protrude too much either, which is nice. With that being said, though, I did notice that it doesn't play as nicely with my Sony bodies as, let's say, my 21 color scope R does. But hey, if that's the one compromise you're gonna have with this lens, so be it, because everything else so far with this lens has just been a breeze. Let's talk about the sharpness now. This thing is tack sharp, edge to edge, really very little to complain about. In the center, it is sharper, leading towards the edges from closer to medium distances. I do notice that there is a slight decrease in sharpness, but it's not really much of a blur or any smudging. It's just a slight loss in sharpness. Landscapes with this thing at infinity, the thing is sharp edge to edge, no smearing anywhere, just a fantastic performer across the range. There's no floating elements, so Up close, it's sharp, but it's not as sharp as, let's say, the 35 Distagon. But this lens holds up to the Distagon everywhere else. The colors are very similar coming out of this lens, out of the Ultron. Look at the size of the size difference between the two. To believe that this little lens keeps up with this lens here is a sign of things to come, because I have a feeling, especially seeing how ZEISS hasn't released a new ZM lens since this one came out in 2015. This guy holds up against it in terms of flare, in terms of color rendition, and even to a slight degree with regards to the 3D pop. So this could be the first nail in the coffin for the ZM line, in my opinion. Voigtlander's been pumping out a lot of great quality lenses, and this is definitely the one that stands out the most to me right now, because it has such a value proposition, as well as just a great Leica lens alternative, because it's a small lens, the performance is bang on, and the handling and everything else, there's no compromises here. It just feels like what a Leica lens should be. Small, tactile, and well built, and the image performance is the one thing that stands out the most. It's really good. So there is some field curvature, which I expected from this lens. So the bokeh kind of tapers off towards the edges. The bokeh does get a little more busier towards the edges as well, but the center third region of the image circle is very creamy and very sharp. Just keep in mind that it's going to taper out towards the edges, but you don't really lose any sharpness. So it's just simple field curvature from a small lens. I mean, 39mm filter thread for 28 f2. I'm not complaining. So there is also a small amount of barrel distortion. Extremely easy to correct with the distortion slider in Lightroom, for example. I shot this lens coated as the 28 Summicron, and then I shot it uncoated to see the difference. I preferred shooting it with the Summicron profile just because I would have the metadata readout, but I did notice that the Summicron would overcompensate for the vignetting just a bit too much, and the distortion was different from the Summicron than it is with the Ultron. So if you want to shoot it uncoated, you're probably better off doing that, and correcting for the distortion in either case is super easy. The one thing that this lens does do more than my Leica lenses, for example, is it does fringe. I did notice there's a few instances on high contrast surfaces and backlit regions where you would have some purple or even cyan or magenta outlining. Same thing goes for the bokeh as well. The bokeh balls can tend to be outlined just a bit if there is any backlit or bright spots. But it's not too distracting. Actually, it really isn't, and super easy to slide out if you use a just manual slider. And now let's talk about the colors. As I mentioned, the colors coming out of this are extremely similar to that coming out of my Distagon, and let's just get a little side by side here. Look at that. I mean, come on. If this thing can hold up against this, I mean, I'm having such a hard time not buying this lens. I'm going to be honest with you. So I compared the 35 Distagon against the 28 Ultron right here. So sharpness wise, very sumiller. The Distagon edges it out slightly, but the size difference makes up for that. And then the colors. So the colors coming out of the Ultron are so similar to that of the Distagon. Very saturated, very poppy, very warm, and the Ultron just has great color fidelity throughout the range, and that really comes into play when you're going to be doing environmental portraits, especially portraits with complicated lighting. So backlit scenery, or if you take a picture of somebody indoors and there's a window at one angle, well, that color fidelity and that flare resistance really helps with this lens. And that's another thing that this lens is very good at as well, is flare resistance. I really put this lens through its paces. I used it for an entire wedding day, and I really wanted to test it as I shot, and it didn't flinch. There are some instances where you're going to get a nice kind of veil flaring coming into the frame, but it doesn't completely massacre your image. It just pops up in the region where you expect it to be. It's very predictable, and it adds a character to your images as well. So flare resistance wise, I would put it at the same level as my 35 Distagon. They're so freaking similar. I cannot get over it. There's a slight focus focus shift. When I was stopping this lens down on one of my tests, on the clock tests, I did notice that the focus did kind of skip a bit from closer to a little bit further. It might have been a difference of maybe a centimeter or two. Wasn't a lot, but it's something to take into account when you're going to be focusing up close for this, because there is no floating lens group, and your close focus abilities, especially given the fact that this thing focuses down to 0.5 meters, just take into account that you might have a bit of a focus shift. So stop down and predict for that. But it's not really something you're going to notice day to day. And the close focus sharpness of this lens is very welcome. Obviously, it's not as good as it would be if it had a floating lens group, but it's not, it's not as good as it would be at infinity, but it's still super adequate and still very sharp. Still one of the best lenses I've used ever with regards to sharpness. I'm blown away. And let's just take a minute to talk about how this is a black painted brass lens. What the heck? If this was like a Summicron, this would be like $5,000 or $6,000 right away, and it feels like that. That's what I can't get over. If you're considering this lens, just go out and buy it. This is a modern classic. It is so good. I'm not exaggerating. I keep trying to convince myself not to buy this lens because it's so compelling. It's such an easy sale. It's a great walk around lens. I just had it around my hip the entire time. And I can imagine anyone who buys the black paint one, which would be, honestly, after this, I considered the silver one over the black paint one, but now that I have the black paint one in my possession, I would definitely get the black paint one. It pairs nicely on my M2, and it looks so sleek on the M10. And over time, as it wears out, you're gonna see that brass coming out beneath it. It really becomes your own tool, and because of the price, you're not gonna feel too guilty wearing out the paint to the brass on this thing either. It's just such a nice lens. It's gonna look so handsome as you wear it out, and it becomes more personal as you use it. Just get the lens. It does everything. If you're considering this, if you're a Leica shooter, go right ahead. If you're a mirrorless shooter, let's say if you're shooting Sonys, I did use it on my A7R2 and I pinned it against the 35 Distagon. It's more accommodating to the thicker filter stacks of the Sony cameras than my Distagon. The Distagon tends to smudge a little bit more in the corners. This one gets a little softer in the corners, and I do notice some astigmatism towards the edges of the frame. Stopping it down remedies it for the most part, and it's not a huge detraction from the image quality anyway. The corners and the edges are still relatively sharp. You're not going to notice it too much if you do mount this onto a Sony mirrorless or Nikon or Canon, whatever have you. There's not many compromises, especially considering the speed of this lens. Stopping it down, the sharpness improves, but it's not a lens that you're going to feel compelled to stop down to get more sharpness out of anyway. It's just a lens you're going to stop down to get more depth of field out of it, really, because that's how good this lens is. It's a great landscape lens. It's a great environmental portrait lens. And even for street photography, it's just such a great combination because of its size. It takes fantastic pictures with great color fidelity and great contrast. It's got a bit of a modern charm mixed with the classic charm. You've got a signature in every single image. And it is a joy to use. You can just throw it on your camera. It adds a nice heft to your body as well. The weight is very receded into the camera body, which is a very nice feel because it balances perfectly on any camera you put it on. And using it is a joy. It's not intrusive. You can take this anywhere. I used it for a few street photos, and people don't really go out of their way to look at this lens. It's wonderful. If you're considering one of these, seriously, just go ahead and get one. It's that easy. The price is great. The performance is just bonkers. And I just love this lens. I can't wait to use this lens more, and I'm definitely going to be buying one of these down the line. So I'd like to thank my friends at the Leica Boutique Camtech once again for supplying the lens for this video, and I'd like to thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you haven't already, please feel free to subscribe and like the video and comment below. Let me know what you think. And check back soon for some more stuff. Thank you.